If there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, it would follow that there is no God. God responds to Job asking, and Job's lucky in the sense that when he asks for a response, for an explanation for his suffering, at least God actually answers him.
Right.
But God doesn't say, hey, take heed, I'm here for you, chill out, it's all cool, I've got a plan for you. He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel?
Gird your loins, man.
Yeah.
Yes, but
for I will question you, and you will answer me, as if to say, who do you think you are to deserve an answer here? This doesn't seem very tender to me. This seems like God saying, not only am I going to inflict suffering upon you, and not only am I not going to give you an explanation as to why that suffering is taking place, but who the hell do you think you are to demand an explanation?
Alex, why are you an atheist then?
Well, beautifully put, as always, Trent. Although there are more than two things that amaze me when I look around the world, or capture my imagination, let's say. Of course, the stars at night are incredible. The moral feeling that every person intuitively has, except maybe a few eccentric examples of human beings who don't appear to have that within them. These are amazing, but what also captivates me in the nature of our human experience is the depth of suffering to which we're all capable of sinking. I think that suffering in many ways defines the human experience, and certainly the experience of non-humans, such that I know people who will go their entire life saying that they've never really experienced any real pleasure. Their whole life has been a misery. But you'll never find a person who says that their entire life they haven't had any real pain and suffering. This is something that equally needs to be accounted for. Now, to me, I said this in a conversation that I had with Trent and the others yesterday. The problem of evil, as it's famously formulated against the existence of a good God, is usually thought of as a response to religion, as a response to the existence of a God. You have this construct, you have this idea of an afterlife, and of ethics, and of a perfectly good being. And then you look around you at the immeasurable levels of suffering that we experience, the nihilism, the pointlessness, the pain. And we say this causes a problem, it's a response to it. But I think this is exactly the wrong way around. I think that the suffering came first, the nihilism came first, and that religion itself is a response to this. And so if you're wondering why it is that, of course, when you look at the nature of our human experience, why is it that we have this wonderful thing that seems to just explain it all away and give us a kind of comfort that we so desperately need? Well, maybe that's because it was how it was designed. The greatest accounts of nihilism and pain and suffering and of reaching out to God and finding no answer can be found in religious scripture. You can find in the book of Job the experience of a man who is suffering and doesn't know why. You can find in Ecclesiastes the lambastation at the meaninglessness of existence, the toiling and the toiling to no end, the fact that eventually all of our achievements will be given to somebody who is unworthy of them when we die and have to pass everything we have on to another person. And the book of Ecclesiastes ends with saying, this is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That is, you have pages and pages and pages of nihilistic outcry. Somebody saying they just cannot understand why everything is so meaningless. They cannot live a meaningful life. They cannot find pleasure and joy in anything. And the conclusion of this is fear God and follow his commandments. It's kind of tacked on at the end there. The author of Ecclesiastes, the person who wrote it, is reporting the words of somebody else, Kohelet, who is the one who's the nihilist. And at the very end of this, the author adds on their own addendum where they say, therefore, fear God and keep his commandments. And what does this say to us? It says to us that maybe this is just a way to escape the suffering. Maybe we just all recognize that we've been dropped into this completely ununderstandable circus of pain and torment and confusion, and we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea where we got here, and it's terrifying. It's scary. And so we come up with a way to try to console ourselves in this situation. Now, if we look at how suffering is embedded into not just the human experience, as I say, but also the non-human experience, then we can ask a simple question. What would we expect to see if Christianity were true? What would we expect to see? How would we expect life to have evolved? What would we expect people's interactions to be like? And if we assumed atheism, again, if we assumed, as I said earlier, that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms who just find themselves in a situation where they need to compete for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? We find a system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, which is not, it doesn't just entail, but is based upon suffering and death. Survival of the fittest entails the death and destruction and suffering of the unfit. 99% plus of all the species who've ever existed on this planet have been brutally wiped from existence, even within the history of our own species. We've got all kinds of sufferings involved in its development throughout its history. Now, this kind of stuff is embedded into the very machinery by which God chose to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained by Christianity. Of course, you could say that maybe this is all part of some grand plan. Maybe the suffering is compensated for in the afterlife. Maybe animals do go to heaven after all, and it just kind of makes up for all the suffering that they're forced to undergo. I'm not going to say this is impossible, but I'm going to ask you what you think is more plausibly the case if we assume either hypothesis. What would you expect to see? I don't think we'd expect to see anything like this if we assumed that there was a benevolent invigilator. But as I say, if we assume atheism, not only do we explain what we see in the world, but we also come to expect it. I think it's a much better account. This is the problem of evil. Now, there's another argument, or another consideration, which is sometimes thought of as a subset of the problem of evil, and that's the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God who is good and wants to come to know us, then why is he so hidden from so many of us, so much of the time, even from those who so desperately seek his attention? Of course, there are people who are what J.L. Schellenberg has called resistant non-believers. They don't believe in God, probably through something of their own fault. Maybe they're resisting in some sense. Maybe they're blinding themselves to the evidence. Maybe they're really unwilling to approach the question honestly. Maybe they don't want it to be true and wouldn't accept it even if it were true. Lots of people like this do exist, of course. But as long as there is one example of somebody who honestly seeks God, wants to enter into a relationship with God, and has refused it, there's a problem here. How can this be explained? Schellenberg formalizes the problem as saying, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, it would follow that there is no God.
If you start from the idea that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, then the reality of the world doesn't add up. Evolution isn't a clean or kind process. It's brutal. According to the journal Nature, over 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. Most died out through famine, disease, predation, or environmental collapse. And suffering isn't just a human condition. It's embedded in the biology of life. For example, parasites like Loa Loa, a worm that painfully burrows through the human eye, serve no moral or spiritual lesson. They exist because nature is indifferent, not because it's guided by love. The theological excuse that suffering builds character doesn't apply to animals who live and die in agony or children born with terminal illnesses. And if God wants a relationship with us, why is his presence less obvious than gravity or sunlight? Studies in cognitive science, like those by Justin Barrett, show religious belief may be an evolved byproduct of our pattern-seeking brains, not evidence of divine truth. In this light, atheism doesn't just explain the suffering. It explains why belief itself exists. Christianity starts with an answer and tries to fit the world into it. Atheism starts with the world as it is.
So the argument that you're running in, this divine hiddenness argument, why would God allow people to remain in error about his non-existence? Wouldn't we think that God would intervene? I think you're right that divine hiddenness is a subset, really, of the problem of evil. We could just call it the problem of bad stuff. Animal pain is bad. Not believing in God is bad. Why would God let bad stuff exist? And my question for you, Alex, would be, I guess I'll run the argument this way and you can fill it in how you like, that if there are at least isolated cases where we see bad stuff, but we say, oh yeah, I understand why God would let that bad stuff happen, like minor moral evils between human beings that allow us to grow in virtue. Say, okay, I see why God would allow this kind of bad stuff. Here's the circle of bad stuff. I see why God would allow it. Then it seems like, well, we've got this other bad stuff. I don't see why God would allow it. But from my perspective, if God is all powerful and all knowing, here's this circle, he could have reasons. I mean, who am I to say he does not have reasons for this other stuff? And also, it's not just that I would say, who am I to say he does not have reasons? I can think of some plausible reasons. So one that comes for the issue of divine hiddenness, I'll give you a few things to chew on there. Number one, I think that God wants to keep an epistemic distance so that we have more freedom to be able to engage him and pursue certain kinds of goods, like sharing the existence of God with others. For example, when you see police lights behind you on a freeway, you slow down not out of goodness for the other drivers, but because you don't want to get caught. Now, I'm not saying this is the whole answer to divine hiddenness, but I think that God, he gives some space, number one. Number two, an answer to divine hiddenness might be related to the other problem of evil. Because you're saying, well, look, if someone has gone astray cognitively in that they failed to recognize God exists, why doesn't God step in and correct that if he loves them? A similar question is, when someone goes astray and acts immorally, why doesn't God step in and correct them? Well, he lets us have free will. If he gives us moral freedom, I also think he gives us cognitive freedom. And I think he gives us that cognitive freedom so much so that even things like giving everyone a feeling that he exists, giving that sign, I'm kind of skeptical that would be sufficient, because there are people, Alex, philosophers, frankly, you're one of them actually, who don't believe in the existence of things that I think are patently obvious. Free will, self-consciousness. There are philosophers who think they're eliminative materialists, so they don't think the conscious self really exists. And that seems totally obvious to be real. So I guess that's a thought I have on this negative case for God. And the way I would look at it is to make it simple, is that, look, if we have reasons to think God can allow some of these bad things, who are we to say he does not have reasons for the other bad things? Here are some possible ones. And then there are marks of goodness in there that I still want some explanation of. So I guess that's how I would look at it a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so let's kind of take this in order. The first point is to say, there are some circumstances in which it seems, at least plausibly the case, that God would have good reason to allow suffering. That there are sort of maybe cases of small amounts of suffering, or cases where it's clearly beneficial in some way, it serves some higher order good. And if we're willing to accept that, God has good reason to inflict this form of suffering, or to permit this form of suffering, why not think that he has reason to permit more suffering or different kinds of suffering? I can answer this by analogy, maybe. A famous analogy that's often given in the context of a discussion that's quite helpful is to imagine a child at the dentist, and the child's too young. You can't explain to the child why they're undergoing the pain of the dentistry, but we all know that they're going through it because there's some better cause that's being served by it. Of course, if the parent was in the situation where they were able to prevent the child from needing to go through the dental operation in the first place, then forcing them to undergo it would make them quite cruel. I think that's more like the situation God is in. But I actually want to imagine that you see a parent who, and maybe you don't know anything about dentistry, maybe you're from an isolated tribe or something, and you see a parent kind of taking these sharp objects and digging into a child's mouth, and you think, oh, this looks pretty bad. Someone explains to you about dentistry, and you think, okay, right, so there's good reason for the parent to be inflicting this kind of suffering. Now, if we consider the kinds of suffering that we see across the natural world, we're not just talking about these kinds of cases of obvious benefit or menial suffering. We're talking about deep, intense, unimaginable suffering. So now imagine that you were walking along a road and you saw a parent just mercilessly beating up a child, just ripping the child limb from limb, just punching it, like contorting it out of shape. And you said, this is terrible, this is disgusting, and we need to intervene. And I said to you, well, look, hold on a second. You accepted that a parent might have good reason to inflict suffering on their child if there's good justifiable reason. And if you're willing to accept it for these kinds of suffering, why wouldn't you accept it for this kind of suffering? It's at least plausible they have good reason. Maybe there is some kind of reason that we are just incapable of understanding about their relationship, where this is something that needs to be done and is morally justifiable. But I don't think it just follows from the fact that we can imagine some circumstances in which the infliction of suffering would be permitted by a good God, that we should just hypothesize that even if we see a great deal of apparently meaningless suffering, we should just conclude on the basis of that, yeah, he probably has good reason for that too. I just don't think that follows.
Well, I think my reply to that would be, if I saw a parent engage in terrible abuse of a child, I have background knowledge to know what human parents are and are not capable of to contribute to the well-being of a child. And so a parent who is dismembering or eviscerating a child, I have sufficient background knowledge, given what human parents are, to know they cannot be contributing to the child's well-being. And also comparing it to a reference class, unfortunately well populated by parents who are abusive towards their children, and that this parent belongs to that reference class. But with God, however, if God exists, then I know that he is not limited in power or knowledge to bring about greater goods. He's not limited like a human parent in that regard. And then also, so the argument that you make, it is subject to a modus tollens, to a reversal. It's essentially saying, if gratuitous evils exist, God does not exist. Gratuitous evils exist, therefore God does not exist. But if God does exist, it just turns out the evils are only apparently gratuitous. And so that will come down to our position we're in. But I also think that God's ability, when we look at the world also, when we talk, I think this is also important to bring up when we talk about the world, right? Like when you look at the world, when I look at the world, what do we expect? The world, like right now, the world, it's like it's like a slice of what we're looking at. Like the world is this 4-dimensional block. Imagine like the world is not just like right now. It's like the whole thing. And so under the Christian view, it's like there's a beginning of it, there's a trial period. The Catechism talks about it journeying to perfection. And then there is an unending, and this end of the block has no end. And it's reached perfection. So then we've discussed this before, and I apologize if it feels like we're going to tread ground we've already tread, but we have new people listening, which is good. One could ask the question, is it better if God exists, would it be the case he would only create a world we call perfect? Or would he create a world that journeys to perfection? And I would say a world that journeys to perfection would actually be somewhat expected, because it has more goods in it. It has the goods of perfection, and then the other goods that lead up to that, like goods you can only have that are associated with evils, like compassion, courage, forgiveness, things like that.
Trent says God might have hidden reasons for allowing evil and suffering. But that's not a valid explanation. It's just appealing to mystery to cover up contradictions. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, the existence of gratuitous suffering that serves no purpose, is incompatible with that claim. And we can prove gratuitous suffering exists. Take childhood bone cancer. It causes months of pain, often ends in death, and affects kids too young to grow in virtue. What purpose does that serve? Evolution by natural selection doesn't require purpose. It just explains this suffering as part of a blind, unguided process. According to pediatric cancer statistics from the American Cancer Society, around 10,000 children are diagnosed with cancer in the US every year, and many die. If a human let this happen with the power to stop it, we'd call them evil. But with God, we call it mysterious? Second, Trent compares cognitive freedom to moral freedom, but people don't choose to disbelieve. Studies in psychology, like those by Aronor and Zion, show that belief in God is heavily influenced by cultural exposure and cognitive bias. If God wants a relationship with everyone, why is belief so geographically skewed? Why is the one true faith always what your parents believed? And finally, his claim that we should trust that God has good reasons because he's God is circular. He's assuming the conclusion to defend the problem. As Hitchens said, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
You said that you think that something like the Book of Job speaks to God's tenderness.
Oh, yes, about how God responds to evil and suffering.
Because my interpretation of the Book of Job is that God responds to Job asking, and Job's lucky in the sense that when he asks for a response, for an explanation for his suffering, at least God actually answers him.
Right.
But God doesn't say, hey, take heed, I'm here for you, chill out, it's all cool, I've got a plan for you. He says, who is this that darkeneth counsel?
Gird your loins, man.
Yeah.
Yes, but
for I will question you, and you will answer me, as if to say, who do you think you are to deserve an answer here? This doesn't seem very tender to me. This seems like God saying, not only am I going to inflict suffering upon you, and not only am I not going to give you an explanation as to why that suffering is taking place, but who the hell do you think you are to demand an explanation? Mm-hmm. This seems, and the tragic irony of the situation is that, of course, God is saying to Job, implying to Job, well, you can't understand your suffering. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You'll never get this. But the irony is that the reason for Job's suffering is explained to the reader of the book of Job. The author of the book of Job explains to the reader why it is that Job is suffering. He gives the story of why God is inflicting the suffering. And yet the moral of the story is supposed to be, well, Job is suffering, and he could never understand. He could never be in a position to understand. Well, we are, as a reader, it's explained to us in the book, but we're supposed to believe that Job couldn't have understood.
But what happens to Job in the end?
Anger well, in the end of Job is compensated. He's given like a new wife, as if that's just going to make up for the fact that his old one died. No, again, it's this idea that you can just kind of, he's like, well, he repents in dust and ashes, and then his life is restored, and he lives, a long and happy life. What are we supposed to take from this? A man who gets has all kinds of sufferings inflicted upon him, has these moments of thinking that God isn't what he thought he was. He says, God, how could you do this? God answers him and says, who the hell do you think you are? Job goes, sorry, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry. And then he's all fine again. Where's the tenderness? Where's the compassion? Where's the kind of New Testament readying essence of Job that you were talking about?
Right, well, there's always going to be a balance between, now God could just say, who are you? I can do whatever I want, and then leave him in the ashes. So there's a balance between God in compensating Job and giving him more than what he lost. So giving him more crops, more cattle. Though interestingly,
a better wife, maybe.
No, interestingly enough, the same number of children, because the Bible understands that children are not like property that you can compensate by just giving more of something. That I always thought was an interesting note in the end of the story there, that God brings Job out of this, but at the same time recognizing, and this is hard for us in the modern age where we have no problem speaking to the manager when we're upset about something. That was not a trait in human beings for a long time, of recognizing God's majesty and sovereignty. It's a balancing act that we can go too far and say God is so tender, he doesn't really care about having authority and being just and punishing wrongdoing. And then the other extreme is God is so sovereign, I don't care, I can stomp around because I'm the king. I do believe a right Christian theology can find a balance between the two.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would just add that I wouldn't mind if I was asking God, why is this suffering, including why you're not revealing yourself to me. If he just screamed at me, if he just said, well, who the hell are you? I probably would be like, right, oh, there you are. Okay, I'm sorry, man. I guess I do just repent in dust and ashes and become a Christian.
Are you sure? Really? Really?
Yeah.
You just heard a voice. Given your background knowledge, are you aware of many people who think they hear God, but they don't?
Yes.
How do you know you're not one of them?
Well, I wasn't even making a claim there as to what I kind of ought to do. I'm just saying, I think I would actually do that.
Okay.
I think I kind of wouldn't have a problem with that. My criticism there was just of you describing God as kind of being tender.
And also it's important when we look at the biblical witness.
The book of Job is often cited to show God's wisdom or justice. But under scrutiny, it exposes a deeply flawed moral framework. Job's suffering wasn't punishment or the result of free will. It was collateral damage in a wager between God and Satan. That's not divine love. That's cosmic cruelty. And the idea that Job is eventually compensated with new children misses the point. Psychological studies, including work published in The Lancet Psychiatry, show that the loss of a child causes trauma that no material restoration can erase. Children aren't livestock. Replacing them doesn't erase grief. Then there's the issue of God's response to Job. Where were you when I created the earth? This isn't an explanation. It's a power move. It's the kind of reasoning you'd expect from a dictator, not a moral exemplar. In modern ethics, the burden of justification lies with the one causing harm, not the one suffering. But the Bible reverses this. It asks the victim to justify their pain. Worse, this authoritarian tone is repeated across Scripture. In 1 Samuel 15, God commands genocide. In Deuteronomy 21, rebellious children are to be stoned. These aren't metaphors. They're moral codes of an Iron Age tribe, not universal principles. And when Christians appeal to the whole picture of Scripture, citing verses like 1 Peter 5:7 about casting your anxiety on God, it doesn't erase the abuse elsewhere. If a text has to be selectively read and the violence constantly reinterpreted, it's not divine. It's propaganda. From a psychological standpoint, the desire to find meaning in suffering is deeply human. Viktor Frankl wrote about this in Man's Search for Meaning. But recognizing suffering and assigning it a reason are not the same. Religion hijacks this instinct, offering answers that comfort rather than confront reality. The atheist explanation is simpler and more honest. Suffering exists because nature is indifferent, not intentional. The evolutionary process has no goal, no morality. It just selects what survives. This view doesn't make suffering easier, but it makes it comprehensible. We don't need to invent a cruel God to explain pain. We just need to accept reality.
The entire picture about it has to be looked at in a whole.
Yes.
So, I mean, some episodes or passages of Scripture will reveal some aspects of God. For example, the Old Testament authors were extremely concerned about defending God's sovereignty, because they'll say, well, look, you think your God is so great. He lets this bad thing happen. He lets Pharaoh enslave you. And the Old Testament authors saying, no, our God, Yahweh, he is the God of gods. He is sovereign over everything. And so they're really emphasizing that. Whereas then in maybe other aspects of the Bible, we read like in 1 Peter, we cast all our anxieties upon him. We have to look at the whole picture. But
Christianity asks us to believe that genocide, silence, suffering, and randomness are all part of a plan. But the evidence shows a chaotic, amoral universe where humans are left to find meaning on their own. That's not a failure of faith. That's a sign of intellectual honesty. Question and call to action. If a God existed and truly loved us, would the world look like this? Or are we better off taking responsibility for each other?
Did Jesus claim to be God? Yes, he did. And I'm sure many of you have some verses going through your heads right now. However, I'm convinced that the primary way Jesus claimed to be God, and that his followers claimed he's God, gets overlooked by most Christians and non-Christians because we've lost touch with first century Jewish culture, and we just tend to not notice things. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Boyarin in his book, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of Jesus Christ, the story of the Jewish Christ. He says, most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century, and even later, can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of the period. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. So the ideas were there, paving the way for Jesus, who embodied them. Now, who is Daniel Boyarin to say that Christian ideas like the Trinity and the incarnation were already present in some form in first century Judaism? Is he a Christian apologist? No, he's a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. He's a Talmud scholar. He points out that a lot of the beliefs we now think of as distinctively Christian actually weren't. The earliest Christian church was embedded in first century Jewish culture, but as Christianity spread, it became dominated by Gentile Christians who tended to lose touch with the Jewish framework. And something was happening within Judaism as well. As Jewish orthodoxy was forming in the 2nd century, the rabbis tended to weed out certain ideas that had once been familiar in Judaism, but which had been adopted by Christians. The rabbis wanted to clearly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and some of the ideas that were present in 1st century Judaism were soon deemed heretical. So Christians lost touch with the Jewish framework of early Christianity, and Jews abandoned some of the Jewish ideas that became part of Christianity. And the result is that today it's easy for us to miss a few things when we're reading the Bible. Claims that would have been understood by listeners at the time might not be understood by us. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to briefly discuss the forgotten Jewish idea that's most relevant for understanding how Jesus claimed to be God. And then I'll show how this forgotten Jewish idea illuminates various passages in the New Testament. Some of you are familiar with the early Jewish belief in the two powers in heaven. Alan Siegel, a Jewish scholar, drew attention to this in his 1977 book, Two Powers in Heaven. And lots of people, especially Christians, have been interested in the topic ever since. Here's the idea in a nutshell. The Old Testament is very clear that there's one true God. But there are numerous passages in the Old Testament where we see two divine figures. I'll give a few quick examples. There are tons of these. Sometimes God seems to be in two different places doing two different things. A common example is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that he's going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see firsthand how bad the people are. So he goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happens? Genesis 19:24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord on earth rained down fire from the Lord out of heaven. This thing reboot every couple minutes. It sounds like there are two lords here. Watch what happens in Zechariah 2. Pay attention or you'll miss it. Come, Zion, escape, you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. Who's speaking? The Lord Almighty. And he says, after the glorious one has sent me, the Lord was sent by the glorious one, against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The Lord Almighty was sent by the Lord Almighty. Next paragraph. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord, Yahweh. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord, Yahweh, will live among them, and they will know that the Lord was sent by the Lord Almighty. So Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh. Yahweh is sent by Yahweh. Plenty of passages like these. Then we've got a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. Whatever you think of when you think about angels, just get rid of that. The angel of the Lord is no ordinary angel, because this angel is somehow the Lord. Angel just means messenger. In Hebrew, it can refer to a human messenger, a spirit messenger, or in this case, the Lord himself. Look at Judges 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down to talk to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Then it switches to, the Lord turned to him. The Lord answered. Then it goes back to the angel of the Lord. Then, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. If you see the Lord in all his glory, you're dead. But if you see the angel of the Lord, who is somehow the Lord, you might survive. One more example of this. Here's Jacob blessing Joseph in Genesis 48. Then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. He, singular. So the God, and the angel are all referring to the same being. The angel is God, but the angel is the messenger of God. This is all over the place in the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these. And they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God, but there were two powers, two authorities in heaven. If you put all of the passages together, it seems like there's God you can't be around because his presence would destroy you, and God you can be around somehow. There's God you can't be around and God you can be around. The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. If there's one God, why are there two powers in heaven?
David Wood points to the two powers in heaven theory to argue that Jews were already expecting a divine Messiah, but that's misleading. The two powers idea was never mainstream. Scholars like Alan Siegel, whom Wood cites, say it was condemned as heresy by Rabbinic Judaism by the 2nd century. It was mostly found in apocalyptic fringe sects, like those behind the Book of Enoch, not the dominant Pharisaic tradition Jesus grew up in. Also, Wood relies on Hebrew Bible passages that use metaphor and repetition, a known literary device in ancient Hebrew. For example, Genesis 19:24 saying, "The Lord rained fire from the Lord," is a classic example of Hebrew parallelism, not a claim of dual divine beings. This is widely understood by scholars of Semitic literature, such as Michael Heiser, who notes that while some texts may reflect divine plurality, they don't support a Trinitarian view. Even Daniel Boyarin, who's often misused by apologists, does not say Jesus claimed to be God. He explores how early Christian communities reinterpreted Jewish mystical language to elevate Jesus, but that's post hoc theology, not something Jesus clearly taught. Most critically, there is no direct quote in any gospel where Jesus says, "I am God." That absence is striking if he truly meant to reveal himself as divine in a first-century Jewish context that was strictly monotheistic. So the claim that Jesus clearly declared himself divine relies on reinterpretation, anachronistic readings, and later Christian theology, not on solid historical evidence.
I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily. And that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, or the psalmist is talking about, the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm he says, "I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High." The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that the people who believed in these two powers was talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, "If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus responds by saying, "I and the Father are one." I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, "Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods?" Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another pretty intense Christological claim. What does it mean? Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verses 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you. That all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day past his crucifixion and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship in his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too, one day. If this is a claim to be Yahweh, then, well, lucky us, I suppose.
Alex is absolutely right to point out that when Jesus is accused of claiming to be God in John 10, his response isn't to confirm it. It's to quote Psalm 82, where other beings are called gods metaphorically. This shows Jesus is not identifying as Yahweh, but rather as someone set apart, like those divine agents. Now Christians often treat I and the Father are one as a declaration of divinity, but in John 17, Jesus uses the exact same Greek word hen to say he wants his followers to be one with God in the same way he is. If oneness with God makes Jesus divine, then all believers must be too, which is obviously not Christian theology. Jesus clearly means unity of purpose, not identity of nature. And when he says, the Father lives in me, that isn't divine possession. In John 14, he says the same thing will happen to his followers. You are in me, and I am in you. Again, it's about spiritual unity, not ontology. As Hitchens pointed out again and again, if this were really God in human form, he wouldn't speak in riddles. He wouldn't need theologians and translators 2,000 years later to explain what he supposedly meant. The fact that Jesus never clearly says, "I am God," in any gospel, shows that the claim of divinity is a later church invention, not something Jesus ever taught.
I showed that in the first century there was an interesting discussion within Judaism about the two powers in heaven. They had various ways of dealing with this. And we can see why when we read passages like Genesis 22, the story of Abraham and Isaac. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." So this is God saying to Abraham, "Take your son." Verse 11, "But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham,'" is when he starts to do it. "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So this is the angel of the Lord saying, "You haven't withheld from me your only son." And it was God who ordered Abraham to do this. So we have situations like this, and I argue that Jesus enters the discussion when they're confused about the two powers in heaven and claims to be one of them. And so there we looked at what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, and what his enemies do. Alex seems to suggest that there could be some sort of angel or something like this, or even a person who's endowed with this kind of divine authority. I got problems with this even here in Genesis. So look at what this said. "Then the Lord," Genesis 33, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you, because you are stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way.' Who was accompanying them and guiding them? Well, the angel of the Lord. But here he says, 'I'm not going with you this time.'" So this is the Lord speaking. It's not the angel of the Lord, and you say, "Oh, this is the Lord." This is the Lord speaking. This is the Lord speaking, and says, "I'm not going up with you now," when it was the angel of the Lord who was accompanying them. So these are the sorts of things you have, and people tried to figure out how to deal with this. And they came up, again, with all sorts of ways, and Jesus entered the picture and claimed to be one of the two powers in heaven. So what Jesus says, we went through 3 examples of Jesus claiming to be one of the two powers. He's the divine Son of the Father, he's the Lord of King David, and he's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And we saw how people reacted to him claiming to be the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. In response, Alex was quoted Psalm 82, and then Jesus using this passage. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So they accused Jesus of claiming to be God. And Jesus answered them, "Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world?" So Jesus is sent into the world, according to this passage. "Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son?" This is not, and I have no idea how you would ever read the Gospel of John like this, let alone anything else Jesus said. This is not Jesus saying, "What? You're misunderstanding. I'm just a regular dude." Again, if this were the only verse in there, maybe, because given the rest of what we read in the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels, Jesus is not claiming to be a regular guy. He's using a legal technicality here that they should be aware of. They're saying, "Hey, here's what you're claiming. You're claiming to be the Son of God. This means you're claiming to be equal to God and so on, and therefore, this is blasphemy." And Jesus' response is, really? Well, in the Psalms, God calls people Elohim. Therefore, you can't just say calling someone some divine title is blasphemous and deserves a death sentence. You have to show that that the title is not from God, that it's not true, that it's false. Have you done that? No. Okay, you can't kill me. You can't just say there's a claim and therefore we will kill you over it. So it's a legal technicality. Again, if you're somehow reading this as, see, Jesus is just claiming to be a regular guy, well, All right. So we have John 17:5. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. Why? Alex quoted John 17 to show that Jesus is just claiming some regular relationship that we can all have with God or something along those lines. What does Jesus say in the same chapter that Alex is quoting? And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. That sounds like Jesus is claiming to have glory with the Father before the world began. Doesn't sound like he's claiming to be a regular guy. Doesn't sound like he's saying, oh, you guys are just misunderstanding everything I said. It's just one big misunderstanding. So what Jesus does, we've looked at it. I think he said he's going to respond to it. So what does Jesus do? He's the judge. He's the final judge of all people, according to him. Again, the Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who's going to sit on his throne in judgment. Jesus said, yeah, that's me. The Old Testament says that Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. Jesus says that he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. The people in their graves are going to hear the voice of the Son of God. Now that is very strange if that's how we all are. We're all going to be raised from the dead by the Son of God. If that's him saying, oh, we're all just the same and we can all, you'll be in me and I'll be in you. Very strange way of putting things.
Let's be clear. When Jesus is accused in John 10 of claiming to be God, he doesn't affirm it. He deflects. He quotes Psalm 82, where the term gods refers to human beings, members of a divine council, or even unjust earthly judges, not divine beings equal to Yahweh. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and John J. Collins agree. This psalm uses the term gods in a figurative or functional sense, not literal divinity. If Jesus wanted to confirm he was God, he had every opportunity, but instead, he points to a passage that describes non-divine beings being called gods, and then says, "Why do you accuse me of blasphemy for saying I'm the Son of God?" That's not affirmation, it's distancing. And when he says I and the Father are one, he later uses the same Greek word hen to pray that his disciples will all be one with him and the Father in the same way. If oneness with God means literal divinity, then all believers are divine. That's clearly not the intent. Scholars like James D.G. Dunn and Raymond Brown point out that John's Gospel uses metaphorical language, not strict metaphysical definitions. Jesus being in the Father is about spiritual unity and purpose, not substance. In fact, Jesus consistently refers to God as someone other than himself. My Father, the one who sent me, greater than I. That's not how you talk if you're claiming you are that same God.
We heard about the angel of Yahweh and the suggestion that this might indeed just be Jesus. It might be. Look, I don't claim to be the sort of final authority on exegesis here. I'm simply asking you to consider what you think is a more appropriate explanation. I've suggested the divine name-bearing model as opposed to the two powers in heaven. And when I look at passages such as Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, "See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him." I just ask which interpretation lends itself more nicely to the passages. David's rebuttal there seemed to suggest that I was under the impression that Jesus is just some dude. That is far, far from the case, especially in John's Gospel, where Jesus seems to posit himself as something of a model of faith for his disciples. And for what it's worth, this is kind of the image that I get of Jesus reading through the Gospels. What is he supposed to be? Something like an idyllic, faithful servant of God, and certainly in a special position. If you include the epistles in particular, then Jesus is, of course, exalted. But I want to get into that, but I suppose I should turn to Philippians chapter 2, which David mentions. Of course, we're not talking about Jesus' own words anymore, but it's still quite interesting what people came to believe. The mindset of Jesus Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage, but rather made himself nothing, as I'm sure you all know. That word grasped there, harpagmon, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing the Greek, but it means something like to steal, to seize. Isn't it a bit strange that if Jesus is God, he didn't consider equality with God as something to be seized, to be stolen? That's how that word is used in the Greek language. How can he steal something that's already rightfully his? And indeed, because he then died on the cross and humbled himself even to death, therefore he was given the name that was above all other names. Therefore. So whatever exalted position Jesus is given here in Philippians 2, and by the way, he is given it. He's given it because of his crucifixion. Therefore, he's given the name above other names. Again, which interpretation lends itself more nicely to these passages? For what it's worth, my favorite interpretation, I was discussing this the other night at dinner with, well, not with David actually, that would be giving too much away, but is this so-called Adamic. James Dunn has written about this, the sort of Adam Christology as applies to Philippians 2, who being in the very nature of God, this word meaning like the form of God. If we consider that Jesus is supposed to be the answer to Adam's sin and Jesus redeems, Adam is made in the image of God and considers equality with God as something to be grasped, to be seized when he takes of the fruit and eats it. And that is how man falls. So how is man redeemed? Well, Jesus Christ, though also being made in the form of a God, in the image of God, did not consider equality with God something to be seized. Not him, but humbled himself. Therefore, Jesus is exalted. We're told in Hebrews chapter 2 that for a time Jesus is made lower than the angels, presumably while he's here on earth. Again, it just reads to me as if at least while on earth, Jesus is certainly not approximating Yahweh, but he's also not just some dude. David mentioned the glory that's given to Jesus in John chapter 17, verse 5. The same chapter that I was using. Yeah. Verse 5, Father, glorify me in the presence that I had with you before the world was created. Just keep reading John chapter 17 and see what Jesus wants to do with that glory. In fact, the very passage that I quoted, my prayer is not for them alone, I pray that all may be one, Father, just as you're in me and I'm in you. May they also be in us, blah, blah, blah. Immediately afterwards, so they may be brought into complete unity. Then they will know, I've copied the wrong passage actually. Jesus says that the glory you've given me, I will give to them. In John chapter 17. He says, the glory you've given me, I will give to them, the disciples. We're told in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, that God shares his glory with nobody. And this is sometimes, a suggestion that's made is sometimes that because Jesus says, glorify me, God, in John chapter 17, he must be God because God shares his glory with nobody. But people just seem to forget that in the same chapter, Jesus says that he will give the glory that he has been given by the Father to the disciples too. Again, all I'm asking you to consider is however you interpret these verses where Jesus is given glory, Jesus is given the judgment, and bear in mind that Jesus is given all of these things, what he then does with those things. And whether he delegates them to other people. Because if he does, then it's clearly not just something that can be delegated to God himself. Only God judges. Only God can judge. But Jesus says that he will judge. Jesus also promises judgment over the 12 tribes of Israel to the disciples. So are the disciples God? Jesus forgives sins, and only God can forgive sins.
Alex raises a crucial point here. If Jesus were God, why does the New Testament describe his authority, glory, and name as something given to him, not inherently possessed? Philippians 2 clearly states that because Jesus humbled himself, therefore God exalted him. If he already was God, why does he need to be exalted? The Greek word harpagmon, often translated grasped or seized, reinforces this. Scholars like James Dunn and N.T. Wright explain that it refers to something not already possessed, something that would be taken by force, not by right. Jesus didn't seize equality with God because, by the author's view, he didn't have it in the first place. And when Jesus says in John 17, "The glory you have given me I have given to them," it completely undermines the argument that divine glory proves divinity. According to Isaiah, God shares his glory with no one. Yet Jesus shares it with his disciples. That's not something Yahweh would do. Unless, of course, Jesus is not Yahweh. Even judgment and forgiveness, things supposedly exclusive to God, are given to the disciples in the Gospels. In Matthew 19:28, Jesus promises the 12 will judge the tribes of Israel. Does that make them divine too? Clearly not. So the simplest, most coherent reading is this. Jesus was an exalted, chosen figure. A servant of God, not God himself. If Jesus was God, why does he constantly act as if he isn't?
Evil does exist, as much as that may be a problem for why a loving God would allow evil. Nonetheless, it's a signpost that something beyond the material world has to exist to allow this realm of good and evil to exist.
In fact, I think Alex recognizes that signpost because on his website, he rails, I think rightfully, against some of the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, where he talks about how priests have sexually abused children, and obviously that's a great wrong. But my question is, Alex, if you really think that is a great wrong, why would you deny objective morality? I mean, is that really wrong, or is it just a matter of personal opinion?
Well, I think that we agree in one sense that evil doesn't necessarily disprove God. I'm with you on that. What I would say is to answer your question, objectively, no. It is a subjective thing. Morality, to me, is entirely subjective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because, firstly, a thing to note is that objective morality... Well, let's talk about what objective actually means, I suppose. Objectivity, to me, if you want my definition, would be to say that it is true regardless of human intervention, regardless of human consciousness. For instance, the Earth orbits the Sun. That would be true if all humans disappeared. Right. Every single one of them. It would still be an objective fact. But to say that murder is wrong, if every human disappeared, that couldn't still be wrong, surely. That would be a nonsense concept without some kind of human psychology. The only way that you could argue that perhaps it would still be wrong is if there was some kind of transcendent being. But then you need to have that being in order to prove the existence of the objective morality that you're then using to prove the God. So
what we're doing is we're reasoning from effect to cause, that we have this effect known as this moral law that is pressing on us. As you admitted in the video, and look, videos, 2-minute videos, 10-minute videos, you can't expound on all the nuances. So if this is wrong, correct me. But you seem to say that we, in fact, I think you quoted, the quote was, let me just quote you accurately on this, because in the video you said this. You said moral truths are so deeply ingrained in us that they feel like they are objective.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so... my question is, why would you doubt their objective if they're so deeply ingrained in us?
Well, because this is where I think Sam Harris is right, in the sense that if you have certain assumptions, so let's say that we could assume that human well-being was a good thing. We'll discuss why shortly, but let's say we assume that. We could then say that it is objectively true that we should act in certain ways, for instance, trying not to murder people. And that would then become an objective morality. Right. So because evolution has instilled within us, through genetics, a drive to stay alive, then we can derive objective moral truths about how we should act in order that complies with this inner nature, which I think has come about through evolution. So even if you don't subscribe to the idea that certain moral actions, such as not killing, or not stealing, have come about through evolution, the instinctual nature within us to stay alive causes us to think of those as objective truths. But it's a technicality. So for all intents and purposes, you could say they're objective truths. If you grab 100 people off the street and ask them, is rape wrong? 100 of them will say yes. But that doesn't mean it's objective. I mean, for instance, I put it to you, would you say that chocolate is tasty?
Yeah, I would, but that's a subjective... Right, sure. Some people may not like chocolate.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
That's
a flavor.
So tar can be just as tasty as chocolate. But that's no problem, right? That's no problem whatsoever. So when you say something along the lines of, so morality is subjective. So what Hitler did being wrong was just an opinion. Well, yes, but in the same sense that chocolate tasting as good as tar is an opinion.
I think when
it doesn't make a difference.
Alex is right to say morality can be subjective and still meaningful. We don't need a God to recognize that rape, murder, or child abuse are wrong, because we understand harm, suffering, and empathy directly as human beings. That's not a weakness in morality. It's how moral reasoning actually works. Research in evolutionary psychology shows that our sense of right and wrong developed to help humans cooperate and survive. Empathy, fairness, and reciprocity are traits seen not just in humans but in primates, elephants, even rats. These aren't divine instructions. They're natural, social instincts shaped over millions of years. Moral philosopher Philippa Foot showed that moral claims are grounded in human needs and natural facts, not commands from above. When we say something is wrong, we're pointing to real-world harm, not breaking a supernatural rule. Frank's claim that moral disagreement means morality must be objective misunderstands how moral systems develop. Disagreement doesn't mean there's no truth. It means we're still working to understand it, like any area of knowledge. Let's hear Frank Turek's response.
Well, no, I think it does, because it's much more obvious that, say, sexually abusing children is wrong than atheism's true.
Right.
So why would you say that atheism's true in order to avoid the obvious conclusion that sexually abusing children is wrong? You already know sexually abusing children is wrong. Now, if you want to use an evolutionary argument, the problem is that undercuts everything you think. Because if everything we think is the product of evolution, the product of the laws of physics or biology, or whatever it is, then why should we believe anything we think? Forget about morality for a second. Why should we even believe that atheism's true or that Christianity's true? If we're completely... I'm sorry, I'm suffering from jet lag here. If our thoughts are the result of some random evolutionary process, why should we believe anything we think is true?
Well, the first thing is that evolution isn't a random process. But that aside, it's
let me put it this way: it's either directed by an outside intelligence or it's not.
Sure, okay, I'll give
If
you
it's not directed by an outside intelligence, then it's random.
Yes, so?
So, if it's directed by intelligence, then perhaps God exists. If it's not directed by intelligence, why should we believe anything we think?
It's this idea, it's almost sort of existential. You know, why should we believe anything if there's no guidance? To me, it's like asking the question, like you said earlier, about, you know, how do we know that we even exist, or that the universe wasn't created last Thursday? For me, it's somewhat based on consensus. It doesn't prove it's true, but reason is one of those things that we need to assume in order to get anywhere. In the same sense, we need to assume that we exist in order to have a philosophical discussion.
No, that's a very wise point. I agree with you. The question is, how do we explain reason on a naturalistic worldview?
Well, reason and consciousness can be explained as coming about through evolution. The way in which we sense the world.
But let's stop there for just a second, though, Alex. If that's the case, why should we trust it?
Oh, well, we don't necessarily have to. Again, it's a subjective thing. But every single person...
But that would mean reason's subjective.
Yes, well, it is.
Well, if reason is subjective, then...
If reason's not subjective, then how do you and I come to different conclusions, both using reason?
Because we have free will. If reason's subjective, we couldn't even communicate. If there weren't these objective, unchanging laws of logic...
well, yes, there are objective rules and tenets of reason, but reason itself is subjective in the same way that morality, you can say, under certain assumptions, there are objective truths about morality. If you have a certain assumption about reason, then yes, there are objective tenets.
Well, that's what I mean. These immaterial laws of logic that aren't made of molecules, how do we explain those on a naturalistic worldview?
How do you mean? How do we explain?
Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun.
Frank tries to argue that if our minds are the product of evolution, then we can't trust reason or moral beliefs. But this misunderstands how evolution works. Natural selection favors organisms that accurately perceive and respond to their environment, because those that don't, die. The fact that we can land spacecraft on other planets, predict disease patterns, and build the internet is strong evidence that our evolved brains are reliably processing information. Reason isn't some magical gift that requires a divine source. It's a tool, a cognitive strategy that evolved because it helped our species survive. Neuroscience confirms this. Our brains are built to detect patterns, solve problems, and simulate future outcomes. These abilities enhanced our fitness in the ancestral environment. As for logic and math, those aren't floating laws that exist outside time and space. They're descriptive systems we created to understand consistent patterns in nature. The Pythagorean theorem works not because it was written in the sky by a god, but because we observed relationships in geometry that are always true under certain conditions. Alex is right to say that these tools, reason, logic, math, are means, not ends. They help us model reality. We assume their usefulness because they work. No faith in the supernatural is required.
I like what Louise Antony said in her debate with William Lane Craig. Louise Antony is an atheist, but she admitted something about morality and atheism that I think is very insightful. Here's what she said. This is her quote. She said, "Any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves." And here she is as an atheist saying, I have this sense of moral obligation that is so strong that any argument you give me for atheism or moral subjectivism will be based on the weaker premises than just the sense that I have that objective moral values and obligations exist. So that was my question originally to you, Alex, is why would you deny the strongest belief that you have intuitively and adopt a weaker belief in atheism or agnosticism?
Well, I don't deny it, because I don't deny, like I say, as long as I do have certain assumptions, and I admit that there are assumptions, I can say that I have an objective sense that these things are wrong on the assumption that I'm aiming for human prosperity.
Right, but you already pointed out that Sam Harris is begging the question on that. That is his human flourishing. And that's a conflation of epistemology and ontology. And as you pointed out, rightfully so, and 18 years old, he's already figured this out, which I didn't know this is 18, that Sam Harris is confusing epistemology and ontology. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
But the problem with Sam Harris's argument is he's going in there trying to show that certain things are right or wrong based on science. What I'm trying to do is say why people experience things as right or wrong based on science, which can be done. So I can say the reason that I feel that this is right and wrong is because of this. What I can't say is that this is right or wrong because of this.
I mean, does this mean, is it a problem for you then, telling people what they ought to do? Because there's a sense in which, you know, if you see a society being racist or treating women unequally or whatever it might be.
Or Catholic priests abusing children, like you do on your website, you say that's wrong?
For me, the problem has always been, for the atheist who denies objective morality, is what right do you have to tell someone else? Because they're just acting according to their subjective preferences.
Well, the subjective preferences, I find, in these cases, we often agree. So, for instance, if I meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, we can find common ground in the sense that I might say, okay, so why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? Why? Until we get to the final point and they say, well, I think that it's because my worldview is better for humanity. And I say, well, hang on, so do I. I think my worldview is better for humanity. So let's go on the assumption that what we want is to get what's best for humanity. And here's how I think my worldview leads to that. So even people...
but if they say, but I don't believe black people are human... What do you say to that?
Well, that's the thing. Then the discussion doesn't then the discussion becomes trying to prove how they are.
Right.
You sort of remove the need for a basis once you find out what the basis of their beliefs are. Once you find that common ground. For instance, me and you agree. You and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of evolution.
It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
So when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have... This reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis...
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection or a standard that you're aiming for to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you.
So,
you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either. If you have a flat plane, you can see like a hill, like an indentation on that flat plane. Now, the rest of that plane is not a valley. You don't need the valley to understand the hill. You just need the hill in comparison to what is neutral. So you can have evil compared to what is neutral. You can have good compared to what is neutral. You don't need the two extremes.
What would be your definition of evil?
My definition of evil? Well, that's a very broad thing. But if you're asking me, again, subjectively, anything I would say that unwarrantedly elicits human suffering or animal suffering to an extent.
Okay,
as
so
well.
that would imply that it's the opposite of human flourishing. So it's very difficult to define evil without reference to good.
Not necessarily. It's not. It may be the opposite of human flourishing, but it's also just the absence of no suffering. Not necessarily good, but no evil. In the same sense, this is what frustrates me about atheists a lot, is they'll do the same thing but the opposite. They'll look at God and they'll think of the evil. They'll listen to Hitchens talk about some celestial North Korea and they'll recoil at that and they'll say, that's a horrible thing. I can't imagine that reality. But I'm sorry, just because you don't like a reality doesn't make it not real. And so if there are no objective morals, then unfortunately what Joseph Stalin did in the USSR was not objectively wrong. But that's not a shocking thing to say if we're under the assumption that nothing is objectively wrong.
Do you understand then why for many people the moral argument is so powerful?
Absolutely.
Because they cannot get themselves to a point of view where those kinds of acts are only really about people's preferences.
But I don't think that's what Frank is necessarily doing, because I think you're right that a lot of people do just recoil in horror at the idea of there being no objective standard, but I don't think that's what you're doing. I'd say that you're being cleverer than that. You're understanding that yes, this is a bad idea, but more than that, you're saying that there's some way to prove that there is an objective reality, not just because you don't like it.
I want to get beyond that, or maybe I should say underneath that, going back to Justin's point, and it's this. If you said this is all the result of evolution, you have to get outside the evolutionary process to believe that thought is true. Because if that thought is a result of the evolutionary process as well, why believe it?
Frank appeals to emotion when he says that without objective morality, we can't call things like Stalin's atrocities truly wrong. But this only proves that people feel moral convictions deeply. It doesn't prove they're grounded in something supernatural. Alex is right to point out that we can talk about better and worse actions based on their consequences, specifically how they affect well-being and reduce suffering. That's not arbitrary. It's measurable. If a society promotes human flourishing, reduces cruelty, and improves life for the most people, that's a clear moral improvement, even without invoking a divine standard. Philosophers like Derek Parfit and Peter Singer have shown that you don't need a god to get to universal ethics. You just need reason, empathy, and a commitment to consistency. Most people already agree on basic moral values because we're wired for empathy and shaped by social norms. And when we disagree, we use reason and evidence to argue for better outcomes, not scripture. Christianity doesn't own morality. In fact, some of the Bible's moral teachings, like support for slavery, genocide, and patriarchy, are now considered deeply wrong because our understanding of morality has evolved. So Alex is right. Morality is not about divine rules. It's about how we treat each other in the real world. What do you think makes a society truly moral? Dogma or compassion? If you found this valuable, like the video, subscribe, and join us for more honest conversations that put reason first.
Considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share. Who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance? I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made. And it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point?
Christopher Hitchens, author, journalist, critic, writer over here, a figure in the cultural life of this country before he moved to Washington, where he wrote for Vanity Fair and The Nation. He started off on the left wing, moved very right, and has recently been defending the neocons. And his latest book, which is absolutely germane to this subject, is to be published in the coming months and is called God is Not Great. Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, John. You'll give me a minute, won't you? Thank you very much, Joan, for that slightly misleading introduction to someone who may no longer be a socialist, but still vibrates to Marxism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I think I'll be able to be reasonably terse, given the very heavy artillery that follows me on our side. I think it might perhaps have been felt when I was chosen that the case for atheism should not be made by the spokesman for its moderate wing, Richard Dawkins. That it might be okay to have at least one extremist on the panel. And I'll begin at once by recalling an exchange I had recently in Colorado Springs with a spokesman of America's evangelical broadcasting wing, a much overrated but nonetheless significant force in American politics. This broadcaster asked me, in response to my own statement of unbelief, he said, "I insist that you answer the following question, and that you answer it with a yes or a no." I braced myself. I accepted the challenge unseen. He said, "You are to imagine yourself in a strange city where you've never been before. You are to imagine nightfall coming on, and you to be without friends or succor in this town. And you are to ask yourself whether you would feel safer or less safe when you saw a dozen men coming towards you in the dusk, if you were to know that they had recently come from a prayer meeting." This is the. I think I can justifiably say I'm relaying to you, comrades, friends, brothers, sisters, the challenge that was put by the religious to me. You'll see at once it's not a yes-no answer. You can't give a yes-no answer to that, but I accept it anyway. I said, very well, I won't give a Sesame Street reply, but just without leaving the letter B, I have been in that situation. In Bombay, in Belfast, in Beirut, in Belgrade, in Baghdad, and many other places too. And I won't tell you about all of them, but let me just, as it were, fill in some of those latent blanks. In Belfast, the capital city of one of the provinces of this, our United Kingdom, as everybody here knows, everything, culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, has been very gravely retarded for at least a quarter of a century. At least half a century and maybe more since partition, and before that, because partition is both the outcome and the cause of sectarian warfare in this town, by the simple fact that there are people there who are willing to kill not just one another, but one another's children on the basis of what kind of Christian they are. Horrible things are done, not just in pubs and clubs, but on the streets, on housing estates, on university campuses in that city still, despite the relatively good news we've had today, where the situation remains dominated by barbaric sectarian party leaders. On this and no other basis. Both churches demand that their children are sent to separate schools. They each agree with the other that above all things, their own children must be protected from the faith of another faith.
Hitchens is pointing out something we keep seeing across history. Whenever faith controls politics, the result is division and bloodshed. Take Iraq after Saddam fell. What the country needed was peace and time to rebuild. Instead, Sunni and Shia militias turned on each other, bombing mosques and schools. Studies estimate that between 2003 and 2011, more than 100,000 civilians were killed, most of them in sectarian attacks. Religion wasn't a shield, it was the excuse for murder. Lebanon is another example. Its constitution literally forces political power to be divided by religion. The president must be a Maronite Christian, the Speaker of Parliament a Shia, the Prime Minister a Sunni. That might sound balanced, but it locked people into sectarian identity and fueled a civil war that killed over 100,000 people. Even today, that religious system leaves the country stuck in corruption and collapse. And Bosnia in the 1990s showed the same story. Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks slaughtered each other in the name of faith. The Srebrenica massacre alone saw 8,000 Muslim men and boys executed while priests and imams blessed soldiers on both sides. The Bible itself doesn't help. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul says, "Do not be yoked with unbelievers." That kind of thinking, separating people by belief, is exactly what fuels sectarianism. Even today, Hindu nationalists in India persecute Muslims and Christians, while Christian nationalists in America use their faith to justify violence, like what we saw during the Capitol riots in 2021. The pattern is always the same. When religion defines identity, humanity comes second.
I don't think I need to elaborate very much more on how horrendous the consequences of that have been and how they are enshrined, by the way, in our own constitution, which mandates that our own head of the church is also the head of the state and of the armed forces, with all the ludicrous Windsor consequences that you get if you found a national church on the family values of Henry VIII. These conditions, which are farcical in England, Wales, and Scotland, are tragic and ugly, only a few minutes flying time from where we sit. If I pass on from Belfast to, say, Baghdad, where I've recently been, and without reopening any of the arguments about the rightness or otherwise of the coalition intervention in Mesopotamia, I think it can be granted by any fair-minded person that what was most needed in Iraq after 30 years of fascism and war was a period of reflection, a short interlude of calm during which Iraqis could look about themselves and decide perhaps for whom they'd like to vote, perhaps what kind of country they'd like to live in, what kind of federal system they might wish to evolve, and to do so unmolested by violence or terror. The parties of God have vetoed every hope of that process. The parties of God now have the Iraqi people in their jaws, and they're saying to them, it's not enough just to kill foreigners or to rail against Jews or Christians or secularists. That's nothing like enough. It's only in Iraq, not only, mainly, chiefly in Iraq, that it's considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share, and so on, leaving out at the very bottom, I'm afraid, such forces as Kurds and Armenians, but making everyone defined in their citizenship by their faith. Do I need to elaborate what that's done to retard, to bankrupt, to beggar, to disfigure, and to degrade what could have been an ideally plural and diverse and happy society? Remaining with letter B, shall I say Banja Luka? Shall I say Belgrade? Or just say Bosnia? Again, one of the most civilized enclaves of the Balkans. For many years, protected by a secular constitution and the remains of what had been a secular and democratic republic, and just look what happens when it is decided that it is a matter of faith that determines your citizenship, your allegiance, your identity, your nature, your rights. See the recrudescence in the Europe of the late 20th and early 21st century of Catholic fascist parties we thought we'd left behind at Nuremberg, the Ustasha. The recrudescence of forces like the Chetniks, the Serbian Orthodox, fascists who took exactly the same view except the other way around. See the craven way in which our spineless media, which always defers to people of faith, say that it was Serbs who shelled Sarajevo or Croats who shelled Mostar, when what they should have been saying was, today the Christian Orthodox militia bombarded an open city round the clock, or yesterday the Catholic forces shelled Mostar from dawn till dusk. They didn't do it because it's a matter of taste. We're supposed to respect people of faith, and we're supposed to respect them while they do that and do that and make this sort of excuse. There aren't enough words, in my lexicon at any rate, to express the contempt that I think any right-thinking person must feel for this conscription of this kind of medieval barbarism. Joan will tell me when I've got a minute. I don't know whether I'm yet trespassing on my rivals and my allies' time, but if I was to add Bombay to this list, the city that was very nearly ruined by the sectarian partition of India in 1947, 1948, where once again people were told it's a matter of faith what kind of Indian you are. You may have to become a Pakistani if you're Muslim. You may have to lose your life on the proposition. You may not just be a Hindu. Bombay more or less survived this, the terrifying ethnic cleansing and the pogrom that ensued when the subcontinent was mutilated and maimed and partitioned on this basis in the hopes of a genuine Indian unity and independence, ruined by way of appeasement of people of faith. But Bombay sort of recovered until recently, when now its name has been changed, its minority citizens persecuted, intimidated, driven out by a new Hindu nationalist party, the Shiv Sena, that says that, again, if you do not follow the right God, if you don't accept the supernatural as a real force in everyday life, you are not worth whatever it takes to become or to remain or be treated as an ordinary, democratic, civilized human being in, again, one of the great cities of Asia.
In Nazi Germany, the Catholic Church signed the Reich Concordat with Hitler in 1933 and remained silent through years of persecution. In Franco's Spain, bishops openly blessed fascist troops. That's not secular tyranny. It's religion standing behind brutality. The same goes for communism. Stalin and Mao built personality cults that looked exactly like religions, complete with sacred texts, hymns, and unquestioned dogma. It wasn't reason that drove those regimes. It was the same faith-based impulse, certainty without evidence. That's why secular societies consistently do better. Countries like Sweden and Denmark, where most people reject religion, rank among the highest in peace, equality, and life expectancy. They prove morality comes from human choice and reason, not commandments from above. And that's Hitchens's challenge. Belief without evidence is dangerous, whether it's in a church or a dictatorship. What keeps civilization alive isn't faith. It's skepticism, open debate, and the willingness to change our minds when the facts demand it. So let me leave you with this. Would the world be safer if we replaced dogma with reason? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this helpful, hit like, subscribe, and the bell so we can keep this conversation going.
Now, it's not part of my case, and I'm sure it's not part of Professor Grayling's or Professor Dawkins's either, to say that religion is the reason for all of this, or the exclusive or sole reason for all of it. I think it would be crude and reductionist to say that. But who is going to argue, I'll be fascinated to see, who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance? I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made. And it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point? And is there anywhere, I'm now going to wind up, is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other B's I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism, or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle, of the principles of Bertrand Russell, who once spoke famously from this platform, of Thomas Paine, of Thomas Jefferson, of Voltaire, and others. And I'll close by saying that I want you to be on your guard against two false issues in this respect, and I'll be very brief. When I mentioned those gentlemen, and I could mention some ladies too in this connection, like Mary Wollstonecraft, don't let anyone tell you that, oh well, secular tyranny is just as bad. After all, there have been fascist and communist dictatorships which have been just as revolting. Fascism, as you know, was supported by the Catholic Church all through its life, and in fact till after it had died, and still is defended by it. One of the leaders of the Axis was actually, the Japanese leader, was actually a god. There's no way of saying fascism and National Socialism in the Axis was secular. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, the same mistake is made, and a religion is made out of man. It's the religious impulse itself that I think we need to oppose, to criticize in ourselves as well as in others. The argument from faith, in other words, the argument from certainty. So those of us who maintain this may not be described, my closing point, as fundamentalists or secularists, as certain cheap and demagogic and opportunist forces have recently been suggesting. We do believe in evidence, we do believe in skepticism, we do believe in reason. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any God-botherer does. But we are open to the argument, and we're going to prove it tonight to you. And don't let anyone dare to imply there's a moral equivalence between us and the fanatics and the fools and those who think they know God's will and can tell you what it is, who are our enemies, and your enemies too. So, I beg to propose the motion that stands in our name. Thank you.
In Belfast, Catholics and Protestants spent decades killing each other over their version of Christianity. More than 3,500 people died during the Troubles, many of them civilians, with religion as the dividing line. The Bible itself has fueled division. Jesus says in Matthew 10:34, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." That verse has been used for centuries to justify violence. Science also shows belief does not guarantee morality. Studies by Phil Zuckerman and others on secular countries like Sweden and Denmark reveal that societies with the lowest levels of religious belief actually rank highest in safety, equality, and quality of life. In contrast, highly religious regions often face higher crime and instability. And it is not just history. In modern times, we still see how religion fuels danger. In 2020, a Pew study found that government restrictions and social hostilities around religion reached the highest level in over a decade. From extremist groups in the Middle East to Christian nationalists storming the U.S. Capitol, prayer meetings have not been a symbol of safety. They've often been the starting point for violence.